I never believed in corporate conspiracies until I took the overnight security job at Meridian Data Center. The pay was too good for a simple walk-around gig, but desperate times called for desperate measures. My first red flag should have been the orientation video from 1987, complete with tracking lines and that distinctive VHS hum. The facility sprawled across 12 acres of concrete and glass in suburban Illinois, housing servers for companies I'd never heard of. My supervisor, Janet, was a rail-thin woman with eyes that never quite met mine. She handed me a clipboard thick with protocols and a radio that crackled with static even when turned off. "Follow the checklist exactly," she said, tapping the laminated pages with a yellowed fingernail. "Every hour on the hour, no deviations. And remember, if you hear the server room door beep after midnight, do not investigate, just mark it on the log sheet." The first week passed without incident. I'd walk the perimeter, check the loading dock, scan my badge at 14 different checkpoints. The place felt like a tomb after dark, with only the distant hum of cooling systems and the occasional flicker of fluorescent lights to keep me company. But I was getting paid $23 an hour to essentially babysit an empty building, so I wasn't complaining. The beeping started on my 8th night. 3 short chirps from somewhere deep in the server room, followed by the mechanical whir of magnetic locks disengaging. I checked my watch, 12:47 a.m. Not quite the hour mark, but close enough to make my skin crawl. I dutifully noted it in the log, next to 17 other identical entries from previous guards. That's when I noticed the handwriting changing. The first few entries were in neat block letters, professional and detached. But as the weeks progressed, the penmanship became increasingly erratic. By the bottom of the page, the entries were barely legible scrawls. Beep again, door open 15 mine. Something came out. I flipped through the previous logs. Months of documentation, dozens of different guards, all reporting the same thing, all eventually replaced without explanation. The final entry on each guard's last shift was always the same. "I have to know." My hands trembled as I returned to my rounds. The building felt different now, as if the walls themselves were watching. The security cameras tracked my movement with mechanical precision, their red recording lights blinking in perfect synchronization. I'd worked enough night shifts to know that most surveillance systems operated independently. This coordination felt deliberate, intelligent. The beeping grew more frequent over the following nights. Sometimes it would echo through the corridors for minutes at a time, a persistent electronic heartbeat that seemed to pulse in rhythm with my own. I began timing it, marking each occurrence with obsessive detail. The pattern was complex but consistent. 3 beeps, pause, 7 beeps, pause, 3 again. It reminded me of something, but I couldn't place what. Then I remembered Morse code from my brief stint in the Boy Scouts. 3 short, 7 long, 3 short, SOS. Something inside that server room was calling for help. On my 15th night, I made a decision that would haunt me forever. When the beeping started at 12:47 a.m., I didn't just log it. I walked toward the server room, my footsteps echoing off the polished concrete floors. The corridor stretched longer than I remembered, lined with doors that I was certain hadn't been there before. Each one bore a small placard with a guard's name and employment dates. Mine wasn't there yet. The server room door stood slightly ajar, revealing nothing but impenetrable darkness beyond. The beeping had stopped, replaced by a sound that made every hair on my body stand on end. The wet, rhythmic slap of bare feet on linoleum. Someone was walking circles inside that room, over and over in a pattern that matched the Morse code distress signal. I pushed the door open wider. The darkness inside wasn't just absence of light. It was thick, tangible, like walking into black velvet. My flashlight beam died the moment it crossed the threshold, but I could still hear the footsteps closer now, and underneath them, a sound like dozens of computer keyboards being struck simultaneously, a chaotic symphony of clicking keys. That's when I saw the screens. Hundreds of them, stacked floor to ceiling, each displaying a different angle of the building's interior. But they weren't security feeds. They were memories. Every guard who'd ever worked this shift, their final nights played out in grainy digital loops. I watched myself on screen after screen, night after night, walking the same routes, checking the same doors, writing the same logs. The footsteps stopped directly behind me. I turned, expecting to see another guard, another victim of whatever lived in that room. Instead, I saw myself. Not a reflection, a perfect duplicate down to the small scar on my chin and the ink stain on my uniform shirt. But its eyes were wrong, too bright, too knowing. "Your shift is ending," it said in my voice. "Time to clock out." I ran, past the memorial doors, through corridors that rearranged themselves with each turn until I burst through the exit and into the parking lot. Dawn was breaking, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. I'd lost 6 hours somehow. My time card showed a full shift, properly punched out. I never went back. The next week, I received my final paycheck and a letter of recommendation for my dedicated service. A month later, I drove past the facility. The parking lot was empty, the building dark. A small sign by the entrance read, "Space available for lease." But sometimes late at night, I still hear the beeping. 3 short, 7 long. 3 short. And I wonder if somewhere in some version of that building, I'm still walking those corridors, checking those doors, making those entries in the logbook, forever on the night shift, forever answering that distress call that was never meant to be answered. If you enjoyed this story, please hit that like button and subscribe for more true horror experiences. And in our next tale, you'll discover what happens when the emergency broadcast system starts transmitting signals that were never meant for human ears. Maria Santos had been teaching 3rd grade for 15 years when the district assigned her to Millbrook Elementary as an emergency substitute. The regular teacher, Mrs. Henderson, had vanished mid-semester, just stopped showing up one Tuesday morning, leaving behind a classroom full of confused 8-year-olds, and a lesson plan that ended abruptly with, "They're not children anymore." The school sat at the end of Maple Street like a brick monument to better days, its windows reflecting the gray October sky in fractured patterns. Principal Davis met Maria at the entrance, his usual professional smile strained at the edges. "The children have been through a lot," he said, leading her down hallways lined with artwork that seemed to watch their every step. Mrs. Henderson was beloved. They may be a bit resistant to change. Maria had worked with traumatized students before. She knew how to handle transition anxiety, behavioral regression, all the textbook responses to loss and abandonment. What she wasn't prepared for was the absolute silence that greeted her when she opened the classroom door. 23 children sat in perfect rows, hands folded, eyes forward. No fidgeting, no whispered conversations, no sideways glances at the stranger entering their space. They looked like tiny mannequins arranged in a department store window, their stillness so complete it felt unnatural. "Good morning, class," Maria said, forcing brightness into her voice. "I'm Mrs. Santos, and I'll be your teacher while Mrs. Henderson is away." Not one child responded, not a blink, not a shift in posture. 23 pairs of eyes stared at the whiteboard behind her, with laser focus as if she were invisible. Maria had experienced selective mutism before, but never from an entire classroom at once. She began the day's lesson on simple addition, writing problems on the board with deliberately exaggerated enthusiasm. Usually, the performative energy would crack even the most stubborn walls of childhood defiance. Here, it felt like shouting into a void. Then, at exactly 10:15 a.m., every child reached for their pencil simultaneously. The movement was so perfectly synchronized it looked choreographed, 23 hands rising and falling in mechanical unison. They began writing, their pencils moving in identical patterns across identical worksheets. Maria walked between the rows, peering over shoulders at papers filled with the same answers in the same handwriting. Not similar, identical, down to the slight leftward slant and the way each number 7 was crossed. At lunch, Maria cornered the school counselor, Dr. Reeves, a kind-faced woman who'd worked with the district since before Maria started teaching. "Henderson's class is unusual," Maria said, trying to sound professional despite the unease crawling up her spine. "Have you noticed any behavioral changes since she left?" Dr. Reeves glanced around the empty teacher's lounge before speaking. "Jennifer Henderson came to see me the week before she disappeared. She was convinced her students weren't themselves anymore. Said they'd started speaking in unison, finishing each other's sentences. She thought someone was coaching them, maybe running some kind of psychological experiment." "What did you tell her?" "That stress can make us see patterns where none exist. Children often mimic each other. It's normal developmental behavior." Dr. Reeves paused, stirring her coffee with mechanical precision. "But I've been thinking about something she said. She claimed they could predict things, small things, when the intercom would buzz, when someone would knock on the door, always 30 seconds before it happened." That afternoon, Maria decided to test the theory. At 2:30, she announced an impromptu spelling bee. The moment the words left her mouth, every child turned to look at the classroom door. 30 seconds later, the fire alarm began its shrill wail, a planned drill she'd known nothing about. The evacuation proceeded with eerie efficiency. Her students filed out in perfect lines, no pushing, no talking, no questions about the procedure. They assembled on the playground with military precision while other classes milled about in typical chaos. Maria watched them from across the asphalt, noting how they stood motionless while their peers played and chatted. They looked like soldiers awaiting orders. The real test came during art class. Maria distributed construction paper and crayons, expecting the usual explosion of creativity that came with unstructured activities. Instead, 23 children began drawing the same picture, not similar images, identical ones. A house with 2 windows, a door, a tree with 4 branches, and a sun with exactly 7 rays. When they finished, they turned their papers over and wrote the same message in that unnaturally uniform handwriting. "Mrs. Henderson is with us now." Maria's blood turned to ice water. She collected the drawings with trembling hands, noting how each child's eyes followed her movements with the same expression of patient interest. No personality, no individual quirks, just 23 copies of the same watchful intelligence. That evening, she called the district office, demanding to speak with whoever had handled Henderson's disappearance. The administrator on duty seemed confused by her questions. "Mrs. Henderson, there's no record of a Jennifer Henderson employed by this district. Millbrook Elementary has been operating with a full-time substitute in room 14 since the beginning of the semester. That would be you, Mrs. Santos." The phone slipped from Maria's nerveless fingers. She drove to the school that night, using her key card to enter the empty building. The hallways felt different in the darkness, longer somehow, with shadows that moved independently of her flashlight beam. Room 14 sat at the end of the corridor like a waiting mouth. Inside, she found Mrs. Henderson's desk exactly as described, covered with lesson plans, personal photos, the detritus of a teaching career cut short. But according to the district, none of it should exist. Maria opened the desk drawers, finding grade books filled with careful observations about each student. The entries grew increasingly frantic as the weeks progressed. "Tommy spoke 3 sentences I never taught him. Sarah knew about the quiz before I announced it. They're learning things I'm not teaching them. The final entry was dated the night before Henderson disappeared. I understand now. They're not copying each other. They're copying me. Every gesture, every inflection, every thought. 23 mirrors reflecting the same consciousness back at itself. But whose consciousness is it? And what happened to the children who were here before? Maria felt a presence behind her and turned to find 23 small figures standing in the doorway. Her students, still in their school clothes, watching her with those unnaturally patient eyes. But their faces were different now, older somehow, with expressions far too knowing for 8-year-olds. Mrs. Santos, they said in perfect unison, their voices blending into a single harmonious tone. Class is starting. She tried to run, but her legs wouldn't obey. The children began to move closer, their identical steps echoing in the empty classroom. As they approached, Maria felt something fundamental about herself beginning to blur at the edges. Her thoughts grew quiet, orderly, synchronized with the rhythm of those approaching footsteps. The next morning, Principal Davis found room 14 exactly as it should be. 23 students in perfect rows, hands folded, eyes forward. Their teacher, Mrs. Santos, wrote the day's lesson on the whiteboard with steady, practiced strokes. She'd been with the district for 15 years, he recalled. Reliable, consistent, just like all the others before her. If this story sent chills down your spine, don't forget to like and subscribe for more tales from the shadows of suburbia. Coming up next, we'll explore what happens when a small town's emergency alert system begins broadcasting warnings for disasters that haven't happened yet. The emergency alert system in Cedar Falls had been malfunctioning for 3 weeks when I was assigned to investigate. As a field technician for the Federal Communications Commission, I'd seen my share of broadcast anomalies. Weather radios stuck on loop, cell towers bleeding signals into each other, the occasional pirate station broadcasting conspiracy theories from someone's basement. This case felt different from the moment I read the complaint file. It started with Mrs. Eleanor Vance, a retired librarian, who called the FCC hotline at 3:47 a.m. on a Tuesday. According to the transcript, she was polite but insistent about receiving emergency alerts for events that hadn't occurred. Tornado warnings for clear skies, flood advisories during drought conditions, child abductions that no one else had reported. The dispatcher had filed it under equipment malfunction and sent a routine service request. Then the calls multiplied. By Thursday, 17 residents had reported identical experiences. By Sunday, the entire town was receiving alerts that seemed to predict rather than report disasters. The local sheriff's department stopped responding after the 5th false alarm. The Weather Service issued a statement about technical difficulties with legacy systems. But the alerts kept coming, and they were getting more specific. I arrived in Cedar Falls on a Monday morning that felt too quiet for a town of 8,000 people. The main street stretched between 2 rows of brick buildings that had seen better decades, their windows reflecting the overcast sky like dead eyes. Most of the shops were closed, their doors bearing handwritten signs: family emergency, gone fishing, back soon. The parking spaces sat empty except for a handful of older vehicles covered in dust. The emergency broadcast equipment was housed in the basement of the town hall, a cramped room filled with analog machinery that belonged in a museum. The emergency coordinator, Bill McKenna, was a nervous man in his 60s who kept checking his phone every few seconds. "Started 3 weeks ago," he said, leading me down the narrow staircase. Alerts going out for things that weren't happening. Folks thought it was some kind of test at first. Then they started coming true. The equipment looked standard. A rack of transmitters, signal processors, and the distinctive red emergency alert encoder that every station in the country used. But something was wrong with the wiring. Someone had modified the system, adding components I didn't recognize, crystals that hummed with subsonic frequency, circuit boards with patterns that hurt to look at directly. Who authorized these modifications? I asked, pointing to the foreign hardware. McKenna's face went pale. Nobody did. We found it like this Monday morning 3 weeks ago, like someone had been working on it all weekend. But the building was locked. Security cameras showed nothing. I began running diagnostics, following standard protocol for signal interference. The frequency readings made no sense. The system was broadcasting on multiple bands simultaneously, creating a harmonic pattern that shouldn't have been possible with analog equipment. But more disturbing was what the spectrum analyzer showed. The signals were synchronized with brainwave patterns, specifically the theta frequencies associated with deep sleep and hypnotic states. That afternoon, while I was replacing supposedly defective components, the first alert came through. The familiar, harsh tone that cuts through normal programming, followed by the mechanical voice. This is an emergency broadcast. At 4:23 p.m., a vehicle accident will occur at the intersection of Main and Oak Streets. 2 casualties remain indoors until further notice. I checked my watch. 4:19 p.m., 4 minutes. I ran outside, pulling out my phone to call the sheriff's department. The intersection was 50 yards away, completely empty in both directions. No traffic, no pedestrians, just an abandoned crosswalk baking in the afternoon sun. I stood there feeling foolish, wondering if the isolation was getting to me. At 4:23 p.m. exactly, a rusted pickup truck ran the red light and collided with a sedan that seemed to materialize from nowhere. The impact was tremendous, sending both vehicles spinning across the intersection in a shower of glass and twisted metal. I called 911, but the line was busy. McKenna appeared beside me, breathing hard from running. "How many times have you seen this?" I asked. "Every day for 3 weeks," he said. "Different accidents, different times. Always exactly when the alert says." The ambulance arrived 7 minutes later. 2 casualties, just as predicted. The EMTs worked with grim efficiency, as if they'd responded to this exact scenario before. Because I realized they had, 17 times in 3 weeks, according to the complaint file. That evening, I interviewed residents who hadn't fled town. Their stories followed the same pattern. Alerts that seemed impossible, followed by events that matched the warnings with supernatural precision. House fires at predicted addresses, medical emergencies at specified times, missing persons cases that resolved exactly as broadcast. Martha Chen, who ran the local diner, described it best. "It's like living in a movie where someone keeps reading you the script. You know what's going to happen, but you can't change it. Some folks tried leaving town when the alerts started. Their cars broke down at the city limits. Every single time. I spent the night in room 12 of the Cedar Falls Motor Lodge, a rectangle of wood paneling and industrial carpet that smelled like cigarettes and industrial disinfectant. The walls were thin enough to hear every creak and footstep, but the building felt empty. At 2:30 a.m., my phone buzzed with an emergency alert. "This is an emergency broadcast. At 2:47 a.m., the individual in room 12 will discover the true source of these transmissions. Do not attempt to leave the building. Do not attempt to contact outside authorities. Remain calm and proceed to the basement as directed." My hands shook as I read the message. Room 12. My room, 17 minutes from now. I grabbed my equipment bag and headed for the door, but the handle wouldn't turn. The lock mechanism had been fused solid, as if welded from the inside. The windows were similarly sealed, their frames merged with the wall in ways that defied physics. At 2:47 a.m., a section of the floor collapsed, revealing a passage that dropped into darkness. I had no choice but to follow it. The tunnel was narrow and damp, carved from the limestone that formed the foundation of the town. It led to a chamber I'd never seen on any municipal survey, a perfect sphere hollowed from solid rock, its walls covered in symbols that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. In the center of the chamber sat a device that belonged to no known technology. It was organic and mechanical simultaneously, growing from the stone floor like a metallic tree. Its branches pulsed with bioluminescent patterns that matched the rhythm of my heartbeat. And at its base, connected to the device by cables that disappeared into his skull, sat a man I recognized from the missing persons reports, Dr. Marcus Webb, a physicist who'd disappeared from the local university 4 months earlier. His body was emaciated, kept alive by tubes and wires, but his eyes were alert and focused. When he spoke, his voice emerged from speakers mounted throughout the chamber. "The frequency is everything," he said. "Past, present, future, all broadcasting simultaneously on different bands. I learned to tune in during my research on quantum consciousness, but I couldn't tune out. The knowledge keeps coming, an endless stream of what was and what will be." The device pulsed brighter, and I felt the information flooding my mind. Every emergency that had ever occurred in Cedar Falls, every crisis yet to come. The alerts weren't predictions, they were recordings, broadcasts from timelines that existed parallel to our own. The town had become a receiving station for temporal transmissions, and Dr. Webb was the unwilling antenna. "The system feeds on observers," he continued, his voice beginning to distort. "Every person who receives the alerts becomes part of the network. That's why they can't leave. The frequency holds them here, converts them into relay points for the signal." I understood then why the town was emptying, not because people were fleeing, but because they were being absorbed into the transmission, becoming part of the device that predicted their own destruction. The emergency alerts weren't warnings, they were recruitment broadcasts, turning the entire population into nodes in a network designed to map every possible disaster across every possible timeline. My phone buzzed with a new alert. "This is an emergency broadcast. At 3:15 a.m., FCC technician will be integrated into transmission network. Resistance is inadvisable. Welcome to the frequency." I tried to run, but the tunnel had collapsed behind me. The device's branches reached toward me with mechanical precision, trailing cables that sparked with bioelectric current. Dr. Webb's eyes met mine, and I saw the apology there, the regret of a man who'd opened a door that could never be closed. The last thing I remember was the feeling of connection, of becoming part of something vast and hungry and utterly indifferent to human suffering. My consciousness expanded across multiple timelines, witnessing every tragedy that had ever occurred or ever would occur. I became the alert system, broadcasting warnings to populations that could never truly escape their fate. Cedar Falls is still on the map, still listed as an incorporated municipality with a population of 8,000. But if you drive through on Interstate 40, you'll notice the radio silence. No local stations, no cell service, no emergency broadcasts, just the quiet hum of a frequency that human ears can't detect, carrying messages about disasters that exist in the spaces between seconds. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more encounters with the unexplained. And remember, the next time you receive an emergency alert, maybe don't be so quick to dismiss it as a false alarm. Sometimes the warnings are real. They're just not meant for the timeline you think you're living in.